Welcome to the 6-8 Culture Podcast, an international community where we share stories of transformation and restoration from the inside out, based on justice, kindness, and humility. Come journey with us. I'm your host, Rob McKinley. Welcome back to part 2 of our interview with author Mark Buchanan. Join with us as Mark shares insight on his books, writing and speaking disciplines, and effective engagement practices in a culture divided. Part 2 with Mark Buchanan on the 6-8 Culture Podcast. Mark, you and I, we've worked together for many years with an NGO. I've seen you preach in countless churches and engage the congregation with relevance, truth, and a whole lot of animation. The power of story has always been a gift for you. Can you share some wisdom in how you prepare for a message? And what does it do? How do you begin? And what are some practices that you find effective to any aspiring preachers or speakers out there?
Oh, so good. I'm in the midst at Ambrose of every year. I usually teach 2 preaching courses, and I'm doing one now. So I'm thinking about this all the time. And I actually preach at my little Indigenous church this coming Sunday on one of the most difficult biblical texts, I think, anywhere. It's the parable of the 10 bridesmaids or virgins. It's a dark, bleak, too bad to be you sort of thing. What I do when I preach is I sit with the text until I live in the text and the text lives in me. And I enter that text from various ways. I try to sit with and keep company with, if it's a story, like the one I'm doing this week. I sat with the text of the 10 virgins, and I imagined a 14-year-old lovely girl named Hannah, who's one of the unwise bridesmaids who gets slammed out of the party. And I've tried to do that to realize how unfair it is in some ways, right? This is not some calloused, hard, swinish pagan. This is some little girl that was so happy to be invited into the party. So I sit with that until this is ruining me. It's messing with me. And what I do from that point is, whatever text it is, I begin to experience what this text wants to not just say to me, but do in me and through me. What does it want to do, not just say? So with the saying, we're worrying about all the exegetical stuff about original language and what were the dynamics of a village wedding in the first century Palestine or whatever. But when you're asking what it's doing, you're mindful of what it did for its first audience, but also what's it doing in me? It's awakening things, it's stirring things, it's creating emotion. So I sit with that. And then when I began to craft a sermon from that, I think about what is this text trying to say, but also do in the people I'm going to preach to. So I would shape that according to somewhat an audience. I am preaching to about probably a dozen or 15, all Indigenous people, except for a couple of us white people who get to hang out there. So this is not your average white, well-heeled, affluent community. That will shape how I deliver this and think about it out loud. I may be a little more stern or something with a text like that with, say, a white community or something. I really sense I'm going to be very, very tender with how I preach it. So that will have a bearing on it. But the other thing I do is around this storytelling, I see if there's a story in the text. So obviously this is about a wedding and things go drastically awry. Or is there a story under the text? If you're preaching the law, if you're preaching Leviticus, there's a story under the text. There's a story why this law became important to God within this time in this community. So I would start to kind of dig away at that story and see if there's a way I could either tell it in its pure form or somehow transpose it into this moment. And one rule I would just leave with your listeners around storytelling: be vivid and detailed enough that your listener can participate in the story you're telling, but not so detailed that they get distracted. As an economy to good storytelling.
You are amongst the best that I've seen at weaving that story and finding those hidden gems underneath the text that have been there the whole time, but for whatever reason, the average person hasn't taken the time or has that skill set to find that nugget of wisdom and truth. The other thing that I've noticed that you do in part of your preparation is you always go for a walk before you speak. You're gone. Whether that's you're at a hotel and you're a half-hour walk from the church, you're gone and you do that. You find that very helpful in your mental preparation, or is it a quiet time? What do you use that for?
Yeah. And Rob, my most recent book is called God Walk, and it's on walking. In fact, I have a chapter where I talk a bit about this walking before I talk. For me, it primarily is about moving what I'm about to say from any place where it's still just head, some scintillating insight I have about the Greek or something. I really want to shift it from that head place into heart and gut place. That the preaching comes from heart and gut and hits heart and gut. I'm not dissuading anyone from also illuminating and expanding our thinking. But I think, to be honest, too much preaching is history lesson or Greek lesson or something. And I honestly don't think that simply having an idea about a passage of scripture does much to change how we respond to it or live it. So I am always trying to get it in my own gut, my own heart, that when I preach, it's coming from that place, and then it's more likely to actually enter those places of reception, response in my listener.
Yeah, which leads to transformation.
Yeah.
Now, correspondingly, you've authored 9 books, published many articles. You've been an editor for magazines such as Christianity Today and Faith Today. You lead many writing retreats. Writing is one of the huge parts of your life. What is your favorite book that you authored and why?
Well, I mean, that's actually, it's sort of like asking, which is my favorite child. Everyone has its own story of how it got written. And that story either is a story of pain or it's a story of new growth in me or whatever. I'm quite fond of my new book. It's called God Walk. And I had not published until that came out for 8 years. And I'd done lots of magazine publishing. In fact, I think about 60 published articles from 2012 to 2000 when God Walk came out. There's nothing I cared about deeply enough to say 300 pages of things, It's a sustained work of love and labor to actually put out a book, and I just didn't have it in me. And the fondness for that is partly it sort of came after this dry spell after these many years, but also it was so organic. I have always loved to walk, and I was really falling in love in a fresh way with walking and discovering anecdotally these incredible kind of things that were happening in and for me and through me as I walked. And I got curious about that and began to kind of field test it and write about what I was field testing. After you run out of your own stories, you have to do research. And so I ended up doing that for the book too. I think because of it coming after this long hiatus and it being so organic, so integral to my life, that I could write about something right after I'd gone for a walk, or I could write about something and think, I wonder if I'm blowing smoke. I'm going to go for a long walk right now and just kind of see if this be so. And so that sense of the intimacy of the connection between the book and my own life, I guess, is put it in a fairly special place in my heart.
Well, that book really impacted me too, and I took a very long time to read that. You gave me a copy of it right after it came out, and I read it very slowly and very methodic. And I had some really keen insights on it. In fact, you probably don't know this, but one of the pieces in that book was a catalyzing factor on me initiating this podcast. It's been something that I've been wanting to do for quite some time. There's a piece in there that you wrote, and I'll quote this. It's on marches. It says, "Marchers in a march are after something: justice, peace, freedom, impeachment, revolution, clean water, the end of discrimination, accountable government, the end of war. The march is about change, just like a pilgrimage, but unlike a pilgrimage, The change is sought always out there, not in here. It's about others changing, but not me. I've been part of or witnessed firsthand all of these that you speak of. And then you go on to say, this is why many marches, even when they accomplish great things, often have no lasting impact, because people who march need to be the recipients of change, not just the agents of it. Now, when I read that last statement, it was so simple, yet so profound. And maybe it just speaks for itself, but can you expand on how this has impacted you personally, and maybe what it could mean for the world if we all embrace being recipients of change, not only agents of it?
Rob, thank you. I mean, we have watched increasingly in the last several months the world get crazier for a bunch of reasons, and not the least is the enormous amounts of fear and anger, and how that has divided communities, families, polarized nations, etc. I think this thing you read touches on that, whether it's a march or not. There's this passion for demonstration. There's a passion to get my idea across right now that marks out social media, that marks out media in general. And I'm all for vigorous conversation and debate. I think is partly the hallmark of actually a robust democracy. In a totalitarian state, that's all repressed, that you can actually voice an opinion or a view on the guy at the top or whatever it happens to be.
Right.
I'm all for it. But we all, I think, are sensing that something's going on that's very toxic right now. And I think at the heart of it is a sense that I am going to demand that you change, Rob McKinley. You change. You come to my view. You see it my way. And I'm going to try to make you change in the most demonstrably ineffective way to try to get you to change. And that is to try to shout at you, shame you, belittle you. Nobody changes when they're shouted at, shamed, and belittled.
That's right. Or like, as you going back to what you were saying, how you came to a relationship with Jesus. No one's just going to strong arm you.
I got to do it if you're going to just, hover over me and call me bad names, right? And so we're using and resorting to the most proven ineffective means to try to actually bring change to others, to a society. But we keep going to it. But I think even more serious or more poisonous is I'm in this sort of culture, we're demanding the other change and not actually walking humbly with our God and loving mercy and doing justly. We're not actually saying, God, search me and see if there's something wrong here. He says, change me. I want to be the recipient of this change, not just the agent. Is there some way I have become this prejudiced person, this angry person, this whatever? I think if we stopped and we slowed down and began to sort of say, I'm going to engage in these public debates or whatever, but I'm going to do it from this place of knowing that I'm probably the one who needs change as much, if not more, than the person I'm trying to convince of my views. I think that would change a lot, or it would alter the whole tenor and atmosphere in which we're trying to sort of see things happen, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement, or it's figuring out what we do with statues of people who are old racists or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
You and I are doing this interview while an elections in the U.S. is still being counted, and by the time it comes out, we will know what will happen there and what happened after what happened there.
Yeah.
But I just think, my goodness, God, change me.
Well, one of the many insightful nuggets of wisdom in the book God Walk. Before we wrap up, you've got another book that you've recently put out called David Rise. Any comments on that at all, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, it's my first novel, and it's something I labored over for a long, long time. It's part of a trilogy, so it's book one of a trilogy. I have had a since I first came to faith in my early 20s, I fell in love with David, began to realize this guy had some problems as well, so that was intriguing to me. So this long fascination with this man and his era. I teach a 3-credit course on it, and I've done that both at Regent College and at Ambrose, so I've had a deep dive into some of the academic reflections on David. I simply wanted to render that story not as, reflections on leadership or something, but a novel, because To me, at the heart of the story is a man who wants something that he himself isn't entirely aware of what he wants. And that always makes for good story, by the way. The main character doesn't know what he wants. Think about the prodigal son. He doesn't know what he wants. Even when he goes home, all he thinks he wants is bread.
That's good.
Doesn't know what he really wants. And that always makes for a riveting story. And I think underneath the David story is he wants the love of the father that he didn't get with Jesse. He hopes to get it with Saul. That goes disastrous. And it's really the story of a man who the Psalms attest to discovered the love of the father through his relationship with God. There's still problems. I don't think he knew how to be a good father. We see a lot of disastrous things happen with his own kids, especially his boys. But I thought I can either write about that in the kind of books I normally do, which are more theological, pastoral theology stuff, or I can simply write that as a story and embed that theme without coming out and stating it and see what happens. So for me, at any rate, it was an immersion, a different kind of immersion into this story and into this life of this man. And even if other readers get nothing or little out of it, or not many read it, it's had and having, as I now work on book 2, a pretty profound impact on my own spiritual formation.
The power of art. And as you've been talking about, that whole meta-narrative through our entire conversation is working within ourselves first. Now, Mark, I'd be remiss to not mention your amazing wife, Cheryl. Both are an incredible team. You've both impacted the lives of so many people through the various ministries that you've been involved with. And I'm sure she's a huge factor in the humility hat that's so important for us as followers and professors of followers of Christ to be. How do you keep yourself in check in walking that humble road? Being a fairly well-known author, writer, speaker, how do you just keep all of that in check?
Yeah. Well, thanks. As you said, Cheryl's an enormous encouragement to me. So the humility isn't she's standing over, pointing out all my flaws. But I think there's just an inbuilt humility to being a father or a dad or a neighbor, where your worth and the measure of your value is absolutely not based on, are you a brilliant this or a brilliant that, but are you kind and are you generous and do you listen well and all of that. So built into, I think, all good relationships is what you call the humility factor, humility hat. For me, Rob, humility, it's not been a struggle. I mean, not that I'm the most humble man on the face of the earth and now I'm going to write a book about it, but I have always had, I think, a fairly healthy sense of my own folly. And even more, I'm so aware of what I don't know. I'm so aware of my own proneness to mess it up.
Yeah.
I'm still surprised and disappointed. Some of the things in my life that I thought I would have licked by now, and I haven't licked by now. They still kind of are a daily thorn in my side or a thing I have to navigate. And I'm getting old, I'm 60. And so there's a limit that I'm feeling in a very real physical and mental way right now that tells me that even if I've accomplished some cool things and may accomplish some cool things yet, that all of this has a fairly fixed expiration date on it. And I'm not morbid about that. I'm just realistic about that. So I think way back after I abandoned the myth that I was ever going to get rich and famous, or wanting even to get rich and famous, I started to say, yeah, every time I put out a book, you get it in the mail and there's another one. And it didn't substantially improve my quality of life. It didn't actually make me feel more important. It was nice to have got on the other side of it. What makes me feel important is when I sit with my kids and they're now adults and we enjoy each other's company. When I hang out with you, I love hanging out with you, and we sit and we talk life, and I walk away from that stuff feeling I'm a rich man. This is good. So I think, in a lot of ways, I've always carried the sense of my own folly, frailty, limits, brokenness. And with that, this enormous sense of God's goodness and grace in my life.
So well put, Mark. Thank you for sharing that. Any parting words that you have before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I want to just say how much I have appreciated watching these very things that we're talking about, loving mercy, doing justly, and walking humbly with God in your life. And I know you don't want me blowing smoke at you right now, but I really, really have learned a lot from you in that. And I think that this triad of behaviors and attitudes are very much at the heart of who God is and what God asks of us. And so whenever I see things that are utterly central to the heart of God and the character of God, I look around for who's an earthly teacher of that. And so I can think of many people who have been that. Both you and I know Joy Brewster quite well, and she's just been an amazing Micah 6:8 lady to me. But you have as well. And so I think that this is such a great theme for you to have your podcast built around.
It's very meaningful to me. Thank you for joining us and sharing part of your journey. Very impactful. Thank you for being here. Much appreciated.
You're very welcome.
We've been listening to author, speaker, and professor Mark Buchanan. More information on Mark, his books, articles, and contact details can be found at markbuchanan.net. That's markbuchanan.net. Thanks for sharing your time with the 6-8 Culture podcast, where we share stories of personal transformation that are making our world a more just, kind, and humble place. Join us for our next session of Impacting Stories with 6-8 Culture. This is Rob McKinley signing out with a reminder for us all to act justly, to be kind, and to walk humbly.